Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me on this episode of Writers at Work is Todd Goddard, author of Devouring Time, Jim Harrison, A Writer's Life, the first biography of the protean American novelist, poet, and screenwriter, Jim Harrison. Harrison's output indicates the magnitude of the task that confronted Todd. 21 novels and novellas, 20 volumes of poetry, essays, memoirs, and other nonfiction works, and contributions to screenplays, including the adaptation of his novella, Legends of the Fall. As Todd reveals, Harrison forged a unique and uniquely American form of storytelling through his connection to the land, to spiritual matters, by a voracious appetite for reading that began in early childhood, and by friendships with many of his contemporaries in the arts. Perhaps fittingly, Harrison died at his writing desk, pen in hand, in 2016 at age 78. Todd Goddard earned his PhD in literary studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his JD at the University of Connecticut Law School. He is an associate professor of literary studies at Utah Valley University. In Devouring Time, the scholarship is obvious and deftly distributed, but what's most wonderful about it is how Todd brings Harrison to such vivid life. As Carl Hiaasen, who was a friend of Harrison, said, the biography is raw and revealing, yet with a sensitive eye for both the pain and the talent that made Jim one of modern America's most intriguing poets and novelists. Todd Goddard, welcome to Writers at Work.
Jim, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be invited. Thank you for having me.
Right. Todd, why Jim Harrison?
Why Jim Harrison? I've started reading Harrison when I was in college, and I think I began with Legends of the Fall and sort of read my way through all of his works after that, and then had a chance to teach him in college, and he became an important part of my life. Became one of my favorite writers, and I simultaneously had always wanted to write biography. And so when I finally got into a position, I landed at a university in 2013. I teach in an English department in Utah. And when I finally got myself in a position to write one, I had recalled that Harrison's papers had been sort of collected at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. And I remembered reading that several years earlier. And when I finally sort of got myself into a position to write one, I was surprised, delighted that no one appeared to be working on it. And I just knew right away. I was sort of passively or actively rather looking around for a subject, and I just knew immediately. It was a sort of organic process. I thought, yes, Jim Harrison. I thought I could relate to aspects of his life that I thought I knew and understood, and that I thought I could write about and convey in a biography. I was excited about it because I had been such a fan of his work for so long. And I thought he had a lot to give his readers. First, I don't think his readers they didn't have anything that even remotely approached a biography at the time. And so I thought his readers would value, a deep dive into his life and work very much. And I thought he had a lot to say to his readers, to people at this time where we find ourselves living in this time and age. And I thought Harrison spoke to some important issues.
So when did you begin the project?
I began it in 2018. I made my first call in the late fall of 2018. Really started digging into the work, into the archives in the spring of 2019. And pretty much got the family's permission and involvement in the project, probably in early 2019 as well. So it'll be about 7 years from the first phone call to publication.
So how did you work? You had an accumulation of facts, and you build from there, or did you shape a narrative first, or what was the sort of technical process of doing the book?
I sat down initially and I wrote up sort of a master outline and then chronological outline, and I imagine how it might proceed chapter by chapter right from the get-go. And under each chronological uh, sort of year, grouping of years, I would write down everything we knew or that I could find that had been written or that Jim had said about what we knew about his life. And there was no roadmap for this. This is the first biography of Harrison. So I had an accumulation of biographical information, data, statements that Harrison had made, and crafted what I thought the book might look like from the get-go. And then I came up and sat down and started creating lists of themes that I wanted to bring out in the book, things that I thought were important in Jim's life, things that I knew I couldn't leave out of a biography of Jim Harrison, things that I thought were central to his life, to his writing, things I knew I had to touch on. And then it was a matter of finding a place to situate it. So the book's organized primarily chronologically, and but with digressions that go into different thematic elements of his life or ideas and things of that nature. Um, and then I went chapter by chapter. I wrote and researched as I went. Spent months and months in Jim's archive in Michigan, and uh, and went chapter by chapter. And I would go back to the master chapter and use that as a sort of loose guide as I fleshed out this particular chapter. And it was always a part of, it was always a process of revising the master outline, of sometimes abandoning it entirely and rewriting it or reimagining it. But it was pretty much always an ongoing process of revision for me.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this, Todd, because Devouring Time flows really beautifully in chronological order. Um, to From my eyes, there is zero evidence that it was stitched together. You somehow um, all these desperate parts that you had, somehow you organized beautifully so that we meet him as an infant. Actually, we meet him before he's born, and you take us up to the moment of his death. And for me, as the reader, I felt that I was just along on the journey. Um,
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear. I'm so glad to hear that, and that was your reaction to it. I think a lot of the, if it does come off as seamless, or not necessarily seamless, but if it flows like that, a lot of that came together, I think, in revision. I moved things around, and I really wanted to I really wanted the book to have this sort of narrative flow, so that you were sort of pulled along from chapter to chapter, but really as if you were being sort of pulled through his life.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It comes across like that. Bear with me for a minute on this question because it's a little bit of a long one or a confusing one.
sure.
So you're looking at his body of work, and you're collecting bio data. At some point, you have to start moving backward through time, right? You reach a certain present, and then you have gathered new information that takes you backwards. My question is, when that happens, it can upset your assumptions. Yes?
Yes, I think that's right. I think biography, probably like most books, is for me, it was always a process of adjustment and readjustment. And so when I would learn things later in the book, I started with just this outline. And so what I thought were the contours of his life were in this outline. And then as I learned things, yeah, I'd have to go back and I'd have to rethink and revise earlier sections of the book. And that's just a constant, never-ending process of starting from the beginning and moving again through the book and sort of pulling along that narrative as you go, making sure that it all still flows, even as it's often disrupted as you learn new information.
Now, so let's say I'm picking an arbitrary figure, you're on your 10th chapter, and you come across some information that alters alters how you reach the conclusions that brought you to the 10th chapter.
Yes.
Had anything like that happened?
Nothing leaps to mind that completely sort of really contorted what I had already set out to write. I think it was more subtle for me. There were always incremental adjustments to my understanding of Jim, to the extent that I could understand or estimate his psyche, his motivations, his desires. That was always a process of gradual revelation. And I think, and so sometimes in the mid narrative, say chapter 10, I don't know that I would go back and sort of rewrite anything substantially. I don't think I discovered anything per se that made me really, go back and rethink the whole narrative in some way. But by the time I reached the late chapters of the book, of course, I'd sort of worked up an understanding of, many of the themes and subjects and motivations and things of Harrison. And so a lot of that was nuanced and developed in earlier chapters on sort of full revisions of the manuscript. So I would go back and I would, if there were sections where I were discussing something nuanced and sensitive that I had gained new insight into later in the book, I would go back and flesh that out and sort of rework that in revision. But I don't think there was anything, I can't recall now some grand revelation that sort of
Okay.
really made me have to go back right away and sort of rewrite from the beginning or something. It was always sort of more incremental and subtler.
Yeah. As a reader, I was quite surprised by his childhood.
Mm.
And you conveyed it beautifully. And in many ways, it seemed idyllic. I mean, he was surrounded by family, and his parents were avid readers, surrounded by nature. Um, he suffered that terrible eye injury when he was cut, but he seems to have weathered it. Or am I misreading those years?
I mean, I think that's right. Um, I think I write in the book that Jim was, he had a good childhood in many ways. He had a very loving family, whom he adored and who adored him. He was very, very close to his siblings and to his parents. He had friends. He was healthy. I mean, he had, by most accounts, a fairly normal childhood. Whatever that means, yeah, a healthy one for him. Um, and I think the eye injury really did him a number, though. This happened when he was the age of 7. Uh, he was playing with a young girl, a friend, and she panicked or got angry and jammed a beaker into his eye, a glass beaker, a broken glass beaker into his eye, and really cut out his vision in his left eye almost entirely. That really disrupted Jim in what was otherwise a happy childhood. And that was, and I think as I make the argument in the book, I think it's one of the through lines of his life. It's something he never, let go of. Um, it hit him at a vulnerable age 7, and I think the suddenness of it, the violence of it, the just plain physical effects of it, of losing most of your half of your vision. I think he was already self-conscious at that age, as most kids are, and I think that compounded his sense of himself, as he'd describe himself as the one-eyed goofy, or really off to the side and an outsider. He felt sort of exiled from the community of his peers and friends at that time and sought refuge in the natural world. And I think that theme that Harrison himself had introduced in various works, and discussed prior to my biography, but I think that's one of the pivotal moments of his life, and it wasn't all bad, right?
Right.
He credited that event with also giving him an off to the side perspective, a kind of a different way of seeing. It gave him a new kind of vision to some extent, that was creative and imaginative, and it certainly connected him to the natural world where he sought refuge at this time, sought refuge from what he perceived were the judgments of his peers, and where he really began to connect in profound ways with nature. Uh,
And depression came into his life when he was in high school. And it's,
Depression,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, no, I was going to add that he seemed to have never really conquered it.
yeah, and where that depression comes from, I don't think we'll ever fully know. I guess, of course, you can have a happy childhood and still be very prone to depression, and its roots are complex. And Jim he was restless and sort of haunted naturally, I would say, from just his very being. He seems to have been a sort of restless, haunted soul even before his eye injury, despite having this childhood. And the depressions developed, but I think you could make the argument, and I think I do in the book, that his depressions began really after the eye injury and then sort of began compounding in his teens
Mm.
to a significant extent.
Yeah. There was a part of the book that struck me after the suicide of Richard Bronigan,
Mm.
um, to which Harrison attributed to alcoholism. Harrison wrote, um, "It seems to me that the brain's work is to adjust itself gracefully to the brutish impermanence of life. Other than in modest amounts, alcohol is utterly contrary to this intent. What's extraordinary. It's extraordinary what great work alcoholics do before the disease wears them out."
Hmm.
Um, was Jim talking about himself to a degree?
I think definitely. I think Jim saw himself to some extent in Brodigan and knew that, and he himself had fairly extensive thoughts of suicide at certain points in his life and suffered very extremely deep depressions. And I think he knew, the complexities of alcohol use. He recognized them in himself. On the one hand, you know, you could make the argument that he needed alcohol. As I suggest in the book, I think it helped in many ways, whatever it did for him, to help him fuel his creativity, to help him re-enter the world after writing. It became this central part of his life. And it's hard to imagine. I think it was hard for himself to imagine his life without alcohol. Um, but of course, in the great risk of alcohol is whether you can do it in moderation, for at least for Jim, and Jim couldn't, and that he struggled with that for his entire life. He says somewhere else, he says we're all victims of our own incomprehension, which is a similar statement. And I think that was one of Jim's great struggles. And alcohol was something that he turned to as a familiar friend, as something that would help pull him through some depressions. But he also recognized the dark side of it, and realized just as much as anybody that it could fuel the depressions just as easily.
No. I want to go back to the childhood for just the earlier years. That's not quite childhood. Um, and you handled this really beautifully because when I came upon it, it actually shocked me.
Thank you.
You suggest that the sudden death of his father and sister uh, compelled him to become even more serious about his writing than he had been. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah, that was for me the great sort of catalyst for his work, for him becoming actually writing and putting words to page. He had wanted to be a writer prior to the loss of his father and sister, both of whom were killed in a tragic car accident when Harrison was in his mid-20s. Prior to that, he had longed to be a writer, had hitchhiked around the country, had lived in New York and Boston and San Francisco, and had tried his hand at writing. And he had the sensibility of a writer, but he wasn't producing work. And it took, in my estimation, that death for him to really realize just how fragile, just how fleeting, how unpredictable life is for him to actually get words to page. And he says at one point in an interview, or said at one point in an interview, he said, if someone can die like that in your life, that suddenly, that unexpectedly, that horribly, there's nothing to do but get yourself down to the business of living and to the work that you want to do. And he did. And he described his work in the weeks and months after their deaths. He described himself as having new vision, and he says something like, the truth is always new wine. He was able to see things. He was able to write. He was able to get poems written, and he wrote the first poems of his life in the months after their deaths. And he never looked back. I think it fueled his determination to write, which was robust to say the least. He was incredibly driven, and and it fueled his creativity and imagination, and he never looked back. He put his head down and he wrote until the day he died.
And what I found amazing is for all the rockiness of his life and the peripatetic nature of the way he was, he just seemed to make friends rather easily. What do you think people liked about him?
Oh, so many things. And I think he liked other people. He loved to meet people, and he would go out of his way to get out there and meet new people and make friends. And he made friends in the unlikeliest places. Professional relationships, he would always turn them into personal relationships and friend relationships. And he was able to easily make friends, and he put a lot of effort into it. Despite this unbelievable work ethic that he had, he always made time to visit with friends, to hunt and fish with them, to cook meals with them. What they liked about him, he's really funny guy. He's funny. He's joyful. He could be difficult without a shadow of a doubt. He could be incredibly difficult. It was his way or the highway many times, as his friends acknowledged. But he had a warmth, a sort of innate warmth and affability, and that charmed people. And I think people were attracted to that. Not just his closest friends, but people he worked with who only. And when I was doing interviews for the biography, over and over, I'd run into people who would just say how much they missed
Oh,
his presence in their lives.
yeah.
The daily email with part some endless stores of his humor kind of woven into these emails, and him checking in on people and sending them little things, and they just felt this emptiness after he left, and it was from everybody, from people who just communicated with him just a little bit to obviously his close friends.
Yeah. At one point you mentioned that he liked to live well, even when he couldn't afford it. Uh, and he really did like to live well. Let me quote you. You say that living off the largesse of wealthy friends who were willing to pick up the tab. That's nice work if you could get it. you know, yet they're genuine friendships. You know,
Yes.
nobody is saying, "Come on, Jim, pick up a check, will you?" No, because when he could, he did.
You're right. He wasn't cheap, and he spent a lot of money and was very generous with it to a lot of his friends. He had I don't think it was calculated, but he had a knack per se. But he had a knack for making friendships and sustaining friendships with people that had the money that could really pick up the tab for him. And it's funny for Harrison, who was a romantic at heart, who imagined, he would be in New York or Boston, and he'd be living in these garrets, writing his poems, and those were the poets he admired deeply. But he really did like the finer things, and a lot of that was food and wine based. He loved good wine and good food, and but he also loved to travel, and he loved the sort of the things that money could buy. And he was lucky enough to have the friends who could pay the bill often when he couldn't.
What on balance? What? How do you assess his Hollywood years? Do you see it as a period of derailment or an essential part of the whole Jim Harrison?
Well, it's tough to take that out of the equation of Harrison, but I will. It was a tumultuous time for him all the way through. I think it was always a distraction for him from the work that he thought he should be doing. He had mixed feelings about it. I think he always felt guilty and frustrated because it called him away from his poetry, which he thought of as his calling. Literally, he would describe it as a calling. And when he was out in Hollywood, he knew he was doing it largely, if not exclusively, for the money. I think he made a lot of friends in Hollywood. I think he enjoyed the money that Hollywood brought him. I think his guilt for being distracted from his poetry was offset to some extent by the money he thought and knew he was earning for his family. But at the same time, Jim had such sort of lavish and expensive tastes that a lot of the money that he earned in Hollywood, he would also spend sort of hand over fist, practically as quickly as it was coming in. Um, so yeah, it's an essential part of Harrison. I can't imagine it being removed from his life because of the friendships he made there
Uh,
and what it did for making a name for him and bringing readers to his poetry. But I think he never got over the fact that it distracted him from what he thought was his real work.
I have to confess that I always thought of him as a bit of a character.
Sure.
Um, but I got a real sense from your book that if he was, it was not in any way an act. And one thing I deeply appreciated was that you liberated him from caricature. You are always writing about a very human man.
Oh, thank you.
Did he become more a hero to you as you were doing the book?
I think so. Um, you're right. It was, I mean, and what do you mean by character? I'm curious.
I always thought there was a bit of an act
Yeah.
that and particularly in his journalism,
Yeah.
I always felt that he was portraying someone he could write about.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's where it comes from too. It comes from his journalism. I think you're spot on. He created a character, a caricature of himself in his journalism, which people really liked and which attracted readers to his work. And it did, I think he achieved what he set out to do. But he often got caught in that caricature because he'd be out doing readings and events, and people expected that persona, that character to show up, and Jim would have to sort of perform Jim Harrison. But but I'm really happy to hear you say that you think the book kind of adheres closely to his humanness and gets beyond and behind that caricature.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I never forgot the little boy, the high school boy, the guy who couldn't find his way in his early 20s throughout the whole book. I mean, he's quite human in this book.
That's wonderful to hear, and that was certainly that. I mean, I think that's any biographer's goal, and that was certainly my primary goal, was to get at the human and get behind that.
You
And
know,
yeah,
no, I was going to say that. I just wonder, my, as a journalist, I wrote 800 word stories about people,
hmm,
and it didn't matter if I liked them or not. You know, uh,
right.
there wasn't enough time that, first of all, nobody cared if I liked them or not, but also there wasn't enough space to do that. Um, is it an asset to a biographer to admire the subject?
I think so. I do. I know that there are lots of subjects out there that are, that would be an incredibly difficult, if not practically impossible task. Uh, but I think it's valuable to understand something of the humanness in the person, no matter how vile their acts. I think you have to find something that connects you to a human there.
Right, right.
And and for Harrison, I don't know that he became. I don't know if he became more of a hero to me, but he continually inspired me. And maybe they're the same thing. I found myself always sort of in some admiration of him, his ability to always find humor in things, his ability to grapple with his anxieties and his neuroses and his depressions, and always find some way to sort of stabilize himself and lift himself out of, the darker moments in his life. And I think at its best, that's what his poetry does for readers. I think you almost experience that, not necessarily explicitly either, that you feel that the poet's grappling with incredibly difficult issues in his life, and anchors himself to the natural world and to simple pleasures and to things that, just as they're grounding him, Harrison, as he's writing them, I think they also have that effect on his readers. And that always inspired me and continued to until I finished the book.
So I mentioned in the introduction that you teach literary studies at Utah Valley University. What do your students think of Jim Harrison?
Well, it's funny you ask, because I'm just teaching his last book of poetry right now to my student, to two of my classes, a contemporary literature course and a literary history course. And we're reading Dead Man's Float, Jim's last collection. And I was a little worried in retrospect after I assigned it, because it's written when Jim was in his late 70s and he has all manner of ailments, and he's really writing about the process of aging and the prospect of dying and all of these topics that I thought might be a bit remote from the experiences of my students. And certainly they are to some extent, but the students really responded positively to him, in a way that sort of surprised me, and to those issues. I think they really liked it. I think they really admire, again, sort of Harrison's ability uh, to grapple with loss, to grapple with grief, and to find a sort of way of working through those emotions and feelings, uh, through an attachment to some of the simpler things in the world, to the natural world for Jim, often crossing a creek, walking a dog, sitting on a log. And there's something very grounding about it. Jim always wrote about returning to earth. This was one of the recurring themes throughout a lot of his work, and that's one of the things I think it means, returning to earth. It's getting back to, in a sort of romantic sense, even the natural world and sort of lessons it has to teach us. And for whatever reason, I think my students really responded to it.
I should have asked you this earlier, but what is the work that won you over as a young reader?
I first read Legends of the Fall, which I think is probably the entry point for a lot of people. I was in college in the mid '90s, and Legends of the Fall was I think it came out in '94, the film. But someone had turned me on to his work, the novella collection of novellas, a few years earlier, and it just hooked me. And then I went back and I read his earlier fiction, and took me up to Legends, and then I just sort of swept past it. And from there, I went to his poetry, and then eventually to his essays, his food and wine and sporting essays, which I really enjoyed too. But it was
Yeah.
Legends that hooked me.
Isn't that a wonderful thing when you find a writer and you say to yourself, "This is my guy."
It
He's,
really,
he's been out there the whole time, and now I found him, and he's my guy. You know,
such a wonderful feeling.
right? It really is.
Yeah, you
So,
feel like you have someone on your side,
yes, yeah,
when you could turn to. Right.
yeah. So, what's next for you, Todd?
I'm going to write another biography. I think this was my first book, and it takes a lot of time. It's a big learning curve, and I think I spent so much time thinking about biography. I'd like to do it again. I don't have a subject in mind. I haven't just settled on a subject, but I'm circling a few, and I'm hoping to land somewhere in the next couple months here.
Yeah. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Todd Goddard, author of Devouring Time, Jim Harrison, A Writer's Life, the first biography of the protean American novelist, poet, screenwriter Jim Harrison. Todd, thanks so much for your work and for spending time with us today.
Jim, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.